Hi, I'm Duncan from Fishhead. Today we're talking about GT rods. What are they? What kinds of GT rods are around? How do they work? And what kind of rods are going to be best for you? Generally, there's three different types of GT rods. There's stickbait rods, there's popper rods, and then there's all-rounders that sit in the middle. So roughly you've got softer rods ranging through to medium stiffness rods to much stiffer rods, sometimes in, absolute barge poles in some cases. So we're going to take you through from the softer styles through to the harder styles and give you an overview of what rods do what and what their pluses and minuses are for each different type. Okay, to start off with, starting at the softer end. So today we've got here the Enfinity from CB1, the lightest rod on test and the lighter of the stickbait rods. So it's got the most parabolic style of bend. So when you start flexing it, the bend moves very quickly into the middle section of the rod. So it gives you lots of nice flexible support for pulling the stickbaits really easily and gently through the water. Then as you load it up, it starts to flex very quickly. It's coming back down towards the first guide. So it brings the loading point really close to the body to make it nice and easy. Also, it's got quite a long grip there. So gives you plenty of ability to just stretch your arms out and rest into it. And then as we go down, still got lots of power, but it's flexing really nicely all the way down to the grips. This one is a classic example of a stickbait rod. So this is the softer style, which is more parabolic in its action, which means it bends more readily from tip through to butt. So when you load, it does have a bit more of a taper at the tip, but when you start pushing it, it flexes really readily through into the butt section of the rod. So what that means is it makes it very, very easy to swim floating stickbaits in particular. So the problem with floating stickbaits is when they sit up out of the water, so the water level is there and the head of the lure sits out. If you jerk lures too aggressively, sometimes those stickbaits want to porpoise out of the water instead of diving in and swimming below the surface, which is the ideal kind of action. So a softer, more parabolic style of rod makes it much easier to achieve that. And a rod like this, which flexes really nicely through into the midsections, is definitely the way to go. The downside of this kind of rod is it's harder to get more technical and sharper twitching actions out of lures because the rod naturally just wants to absorb all of your action. So when you do short, sharp twitches, the rod wants to soak it up for you. Also, if you're into really setting hooks hard and fast, then the softer rod obviously will flex a lot more and will try and absorb some of your action of hook setting. When you're hooked up to a fish, typically these rods are nice and comfortable. Because they load well down into the blank, it allows the loading point to come closer to the angler when you're fighting the fish. So it makes it easiest for people who are either fighting fish for a long time. So obviously that can be big GTs, but also can be, if you're catching tunas and things like that with the same rod, then the fights can be quite long. So the more parabolic, softer rods are definitely more comfortable in that regard. Where the downside when you're fighting the fish, if you're trying to steer a big GT under the boat and it keeps wanting to swim back underneath the boat, sometimes it's nicer to have a stiffer bottom end to be able to really drive the fish and dominate the fish around the boat. So definitely the softer, more parabolic rods, they work the floating stickbaits beautifully. They don't tend to work bigger poppers very well because the rod flexes and saturates out too easily. So it doesn't really rip the popper through the water and get that noisy splash that you're looking for. But people do still use these with smaller cut face poppers to good effect. Moving on from there, we have a stickbait rod from FCL Labo. This is the UCB 81MH. So there's actually two MHs in their range. One is more popper oriented, but this is the more stickbait oriented one. So this one is a step up in power and also stiffness compared to the Enfinity before. So the taper is quite different. So you can see initially there's a lot more of the bend goes to the tip of the rod, so it has a faster taper and it stiffens up here. So this softer section, this is what's helping you working the stick baits. But then the stiffer section in the middle here is allowing you to get a more lively technical action from the stick baits, and also gives you a little bit of room there to work the poppers. This rod is also stiffens up as you get down towards the first guide. There's considerably more stiffness. So that tip folds out the way, and then you hit the power band. And we can really pull hard. Alex is straight into 2 hands now. So lots of power, but also more effort. So this rod has more of the characteristics that many people like for fighting GTs, which is a nice solid bottom end, which allows you to dominate and steer the fish around so that you can cut down the fight time, but it still maintains that softer tip section for working the stick baits. It's not quite as easy on the angler when you're working floating stick baits or when you're fighting the fish, but it certainly does still give a really good action to stick baits. And if you want to get more chopping, darting, technical actions, the stiffness in the middle of this rod gives you more ability to do that. So you can do less of a sweep, more of taps, chops, little rips, and you'll get a more lively action from your stick baits. Having a slightly stiffer midsection also allows you to work some bigger poppers as well. So in this case, the rod is designed to cast from 100 to 200 grams, and I would have no trouble throwing some, say, 125 gram poppers on this. But once you get up to bigger cup face poppers, it's really going to struggle again and start to flex right out. So it's not going to be so easy with the bigger poppers. Definitely a popular choice where you want to have a bit more control over your stick baits in terms of being able to do steady long sweeps and more technical actions. From there we move into the classic sort of all-rounder GT rods. So this is definitely the most popular area that you see, because most people who probably only have one GT rod, you would typically go for an all-rounder. You're going to use one rod to handle every kind of lure that you can possibly throw. So we've got here, this one is the Zenaq Tobizo 83-150, definitely one of the most popular choices in that range. So this rod also has a bit more of a tip taper. So it's got that initial faster tapered tip, but there's more stiffness all the way out to the tip. So it takes a bit more effort to deflect. And this is what helps you pull the bigger poppers and things like that through the water. Again, we've gone from this tippy section into a stiffer midsection and then loads all the way through. So as an all-rounder rod, this one is like a medium power rod, still plenty powerful enough for most fish, but it's a bit easier on the body than some of the heavier class rods. If you were to characterize it in terms of what percent stick bait and what percent popper, I'd say this is more like a 60-40, 60% stick baits, 40% poppers style of rod. And it's got that slightly softer tip, which merges into a stiffer midsection and yeah, more support as you go through to the bottom. So this rod, it handles poppers up to 130, 140 grams without any dramas, but it will still handle stick baits at the lighter end as well. So it kind of sits nicely in the middle. It's not going to be as easy on the body as going for one of the really soft parabolic styles of stick bait rods, but likewise, it's a whole lot easier to cast all day long than one of the stiffer, heavier popper rods. Another example of the all-rounder rod. This is an FCL Labo again, the 81 Extreme H. It's typical FCL style in that it is quite stiff and responsive all the way to the tip. So when you let go of the rod, it goes from bent to straight very quickly. So you get that nice snappy, responsive feel. Also, we've got a rod, we've gone back to a slightly more moderate taper. So there's not as much of a tip taper. That gives you a little bit more comfort with the bigger lures, but there's enough stiffness there to pull bigger poppers through the water. And then as you load on it, to make it easy with heavy loads, again, it starts to flex all the way through. So more moderate taper, but just lots and lots of power. So it does similar kind of concept to what the Zenaq we just picked up was, but everything is just beefed up. So this is a rod which will cast up to, it says max 250 grams. That's pretty hefty weights, but it's quite at home casting well over the 200 gram mark. So if you're looking for a big rod to be your all-rounder for some of the really big fish locations like Oman, or some of the deeper shoals fishing in the Pacific and deep ledges, then this is the ideal rod for it. So it's considerably stiffer at the tip, but it still has a bit of give, and then again, everything is stiffened up. So this is a heavy class rod, but it's still an all-rounder. So whereas with the Zenaq, your happy place is going to be, say, 90 to 150 grams, this one is quite happy with anywhere from about 130 gram lures through to 230 gram lures. So everything is just shuffled up the scale a bit. Then we move into the more popper specific rods. So these rods are really designed for moving big cup face poppers through the water with a minimum of effort. So often people shy away from big popper rods because they go, oh, they're too stiff, they're really hard to work. But you do have to work with what the rod does best, which is the stiffness allows you to do things like when you're sweeping a big cup face popper, you can just lift the rod and you don't need to use a whole lot of effort. You just drop down nice and hard and you get a really explosive action from the lures. If you tried to do that with softer rods, instead of just dropping the rod and getting a really big bloop and rip, you'd have to go rip all the way through, and you end up using a lot more muscles trying to pull the poppers through the water. So I would say some of the complaints people have against using poppers stems from the fact that they're using a rod which is not really designed to pull that big popper through the water. Of course, it still does take more effort and energy to work big poppers, but the results can be really worth it. So a popper rod, a specific popper rod, definitely makes pulling those bigger cup face lures through the water much easier. In this case, the HOTS Gipang 75 XXH, this is quite a short rod, so much shorter rod for working poppers, and it's designed for pulling the big lures through the water. Initially, it's not as stiff as you might think it would be, because there have been a lot of rods in the past for big poppers that were absolute broomsticks. And when you pick it up at first, you think, oh, this is going to be really stiff. But it's not so bad. It's definitely got an initial tip taper there. So when you're pulling a really big lure, the tip will start to fold out the way a bit, leaving you with a shorter lever to really aggressively pull the popper through the water. As we start to work our way down, you lean back on that, we're into a lot of stiffness through here. So this is what really pulls the big lures through the water. And then we get down to the butt, and it just gets more and more power. So there's lots of power in this shorter rod. So that's often a feature of big popper rods, is that they're shorter, because you can still get a good cast distance with a nice stiff punchy rod. And then when you go to work the lure, having that shorter length just transmits your action to the lure much faster. You know, short and stiff, that little crowbar action really gets the popper moving, and yeah, twitches the lures nice and easy. So this one, it's not quite as stiff at the tip as you might think it would be, but it definitely has a lot of support as you get into the middle. It's stiffer, and also the carbon responds really quickly. So everything rips back nice and fast, and it transmits all your effort straight to the popper. The good thing with these shorter rods when you fight the fish also is a shorter lever brings the leverage point back to your body. So again, although they are stiff, you can often knock over big fish relatively quickly, because you can put lots of effort into a fight over a short period of time and really take it to the fish. So yeah, that's our popper rod. Okay, so we've talked about all the different styles of GT rods, how they bend, running from the softer stickbait rods to the all-rounder style rods through to the stiffer popper rods. And we've also looked at how those rods can influence the action of your lures and the way that you fight fish. So then we move on to what kind of rod is going to be suitable for me. So it depends, for starters, on where you're going to fish. If you fish on the shallow water areas, such as a good example is the Great Barrier Reef, where there's huge amounts of areas there that you can fish that are all relatively shallow, and the water's usually quite clean and clear. So huge lures are not needed. So it's not always beneficial to go to the heavier class rods. So the lighter rods like the One Enfinity that fishes the smaller lures well, and the Zenaq Tobizo 83-150, which all fish really nicely at the lighter end of the range, are ideal places to start there. On the other hand, if you fish in places where there are deep drop-offs, shoals that run in 20 to 40 metres deep, all those areas where you're trying to bring fish from a great depth up to the surface, those are places where people tend to fish with bigger lures. So that's where, for stick baits, the FCL Labo 81mH stick bait rod comes in handy, much bigger sticks, and also heavy all-rounder like the, what do we have, the FCL Labo 81H, and then also the big popper rods. Those are all focused on working from medium through to large to very large lures, and those are ideal for those deeper places. After that, when you look at what size of lures, you work back towards, do you want to use poppers or stick baits? Do you want to use both? Most people tend to use a mixture of lures on their rods, but at some point, every stick bait rod can work some poppers if you go small enough with the cups. And even the giant popper rods can work stick baits as long as you throw a big enough stick bait to give it a bit of resistance through the water. So typically if you're 90% stick baits, then I would be looking at stuff like the One Enfinity or the FCL Labo 81mH stick bait rod. If you see yourself doing more 50-50 kind of split, then you're straight in the realm of the all-rounders. And if you're thinking more 60-40 or even 100% poppers, then certainly head towards the big popper rod. Lastly, you need to look at how much comfort you need. So if you're super fit and you can cast for days and days on end throwing big lures, then you can pick any of the rods here and you'll be able to just power through, and you'll get great action out of your lures, and you'll also be able to put a huge amount of power onto the fish if you fish some of the heavier rods. But for most mere mortals, we get tired after a day, half a day sometimes, of casting. So there's a lot of compromise there between what you'd like to do versus what you physically can do. Especially if you're planning trips that go for 5, 6, 7 days, it's going to be really hard to just fish big, heavy lures all the time. So you do need to look at what is going to be comfortable to allow you to keep fishing. Because at the end of the day, it's not always about exactly what kind of lure that you throw, but just the fact that you have a lure in the water as much as possible and you make the most number of casts. Often that is a major contributor towards catching the most fish. So yeah, be realistic about what your abilities are. And if your ability is not so great, head towards more of the softer rods, so more the stick bait style rods and rods which are easier on the body when you're fighting fish. If you're big and strong and fit, then definitely look more at some of the stiffer, more responsive rods. You can get a lot out of them and you can really go hard when you hook into a really big fish. Lastly, I would also look at whether you're going for one rod or you're thinking of having multiple rods. Most people who just get into GT fishing, they're only really thinking about one rod. So for, I would say 85–90% of people, that's going to be an all-rounder style of rod, because one rod, you want something that's going to do a bit of everything. However, if you're thinking, hey, I'm really going to get into this and I'm going to do a lot of it, then it becomes a bit more, you want to be a bit more strategic about perhaps going for a softer stick bait rod and a stiffer popper rod. Or maybe the other way is to go for a lighter all-rounder and a heavier all-rounder, so you get a nice crossover between the different sizes of lures. Whichever way you go, there's no right or wrong there. It really comes down to what you like the feel of. If you've enjoyed watching this, we'll have more videos coming out shortly. Follow us and also hit us up with any questions you have for new videos you'd like to see. Thanks very much.